Hi everyone, my name is James and I run nursery nook training and consultancy, and today I want to talk to you about creating your culture. Not cultural capital, calm down, sit down, I'm not on about that again. This is something entirely different. This is what underpins all of the changes that we make in our setting or to our provision. For any one of my training courses, this is an essential video that you need to watch, which is why it's free. Yay! So settle in, this video will take you through the different aspects of your culture that you need to consider when you're making changes to your provision and your practice. I believe there are 6 different areas to your culture, and I call it creating your culture because I believe that we have the power to make changes to our culture. We don't just accept that things are the way they are. Some of these are a bit more difficult to change, they're a bit more long-term, some of them are short-term changes, and things change every year with the children. There are 6 different areas I consider that impact your culture. The first is children, parents and families, staff, leadership, community and environment. And now I'm going to go through each of those 6 areas and talk to you about the different things that could impact your culture and why it is different for each individual setting. The first of these areas that we need to consider is children, and we should be putting children first. It should be our first start when we're designing provision or designing activities for our children. But I will put my hands up and I will say, actually, I don't always put the children first when I'm designing activities and provisions. Sometimes what I want comes first, and it shouldn't, but you know, I'm a human being, it's the way it goes. So, thinking about the different things that make our culture unique in terms of children, think about the mix of children you've got, especially around your linguistic abilities. Do your children have really good language skills? Do they come to you speaking in full sentences with lots of vocabulary because of lots of experiences? Or are they new to English? Do they have English as an additional language? Are they struggling to acquire some new sounds and some new words? If they are, obviously the type of provision you'll be designing will be things that are quite intricate, exciting and curious because you want to be providing children with opportunities to be exposed to this new language. Do you have children with SEND? In which case, do you have to think carefully about the way you design your provision to make sure that all children can access it? Maybe you've got a child in a wheelchair who can't access things on the floor, so you shouldn't really be designing provision with things on a lower level. Everything should be accessible for them. Maybe you've got children who are quite oral because they might have a particular condition, in which case do you need to make sure you're providing larger resources? Do you have a one-to-one support for your child? If you don't, if they're working in the provision individually, independently, then you need to make sure that that provision reflects that child as well as everybody else. What are the interests of the child and the children? Do they have a really particular interest in dinosaurs, in unicorns? Everyone's obsessed with unicorns lately. In superheroes, in pens, I don't know, random. But if you've got an interest and it's there in your classroom, your setting, are you following it through? Does your provision reflect those interests? And is it contained within a specific topic or theme, or is it allowed to become part of your continuous provision? Do you have activities that link back to your children's interests? And what experiences do children have? Unfortunately, I have had quite a lot of children who've had limited life experiences. Working in inner city Bradford, I've had children with me who thought that when they went to this artificial pond in the city centre, that was the sea. They were very confused by the concept, and that's horrible to think about, that these children have never experienced that. But being in Bradford, we're in the middle of the country, so it's bound to happen. These children don't have access to lots of money in order to be able to visit the seaside. Do your children have experiences that reflect the type of provision that you designed? Do your children know what a skyscraper looks like, what a bridge looks like? Have they been underneath the London Shard and looked up? If they're talking about farms and animals, have they actually been to a farm? Do they understand what these animals look like and feel like, and the size comparison? I appreciate many of us are trying to put things like school trips in place or visits to local environments, but when we have very young children, it's not possible to have all those things, and we hope that parents will be doing some of those things, but they might not be, in which case we have to consider that. What impact has COVID had on your children? So the vast majority of children with us in early years now have had a limited amount of socialising and a limited amount of access to provision over the last few years. There's plenty of charts going around to explain when the last normal year a child had, and at the moment as I'm recording this, the children in year 2 last had a normal year in nursery, and so obviously we have a big group of children who haven't had the typical experiences that we're used to, so we can't really design typical provision. That's something I'm noticing as we're talking much more about loose parts. These children are looking at loose parts and going, what is this? Why am I playing with this bit of tat? Where's my toy? Because they've been at home for such a long time and they're not used to playing with these types of resources. What is your gender and sex balance like, and do you think it makes a difference? I'm not going to go into the difference between gender and sex and why it may make a difference, but we have to accept the fact that children come to us from a home or from an environment where it's likely they will have been exposed to what it means to be a boy or a girl through their types of activities, their toys, their play and their language. In which case, when you have a setting of 30 children and you have, say, 10 boys who are very boisterous because they've been told they're allowed to climb trees and run all over the place, and 20 girls who are in the corner reading, does that make a difference in terms of the provision that you're designing? You might not think it does. Actually, I'm more than happy to be running outside with the boys. I find it's a bit harder sometimes to sit with the girls and read. But it all depends on your staff, I suppose, and whether or not you have a big group of boys or a small group of boys or girls, and whether you think that makes a difference will impact the type of provision you design, whether you have things on a large scale or a small scale, more intricate or more accessible. And what are the prior settings like? Are the children coming to you who have had access to high quality early years in the past? Like I said earlier on, lots of children have come from home environments because of COVID. They've not had opportunities to expand their language skills, expand their knowledge of the world, and to socialise. And some of the children will also be coming to you looking at resources and thinking, what is that about? These tiny little plastic bears, what is that all about? Compare bears, never heard of that. What's a Unifix? But because they've not had those experiences before, whether it's because of COVID or not, those children will need to have some support within the provision. So when you're designing, say, your maths area at the beginning for a group of children coming in, you need to be conscious of the types of experiences they've had. Otherwise, they will not be able to access those resources in the way you want unless you spend some time modelling those. And then thinking of the second aspect, parents and families. So parents can be the most beautiful, helpful group of people in the world. They can also be the biggest hindrance if you have a group of parents who are not on board with what you are saying and doing. And first of all, we have to consider why parents have selected us as an early years setting. If you're a reception class, the likelihood is they haven't necessarily chosen you and your classroom. They've chosen either the school or been given the school. But many nurseries have to contend with the fact that there's competition in the area, childminders as well. And so we have to consider what makes us unique and what makes us stand out in order to form those good relationships with parents. I'm going to assume you've got parents relatively on board for the rest of this session. If you haven't, good luck. So the first thing I want to think about is this concept of cash-rich, time-poor parenting. So perhaps you might have some parents who drop off very early in the morning and they pick up very late at night, and they don't spend much time with their children on a weekday, potentially not even on a weekend. But they do try to make up for it with experiences where lots of money is sort of ploughed into the activity, such as going on quite exotic holidays, giving them an iPad Pro and saying, yeah, go for it. And I've had lots of those parents in the past, and we're not judging those parents because everyone lives a different life. But in terms of our provision and the type of conversations we will have around that, we need to be conscious that those parents aren't potentially as on board or as in touch with the children as we would like them to be. So lots of the things that we'd like the children to be exposed to or extensions of learning that could happen at home might not necessarily happen. So in which case we need to create opportunities in our provision and through our activities to make sure that that learning is extended. Do you have some single parent families or same-sex parent families? That will make an impact in terms of the conversations you have with children through your home corners and through your circle time and things like that. And obviously we can be quite sensitive to that through the use of books, through the use of puppets, and really lots and lots of conversations. No child ever thinks something is unusual in terms of a family unit. It's up to us to make sure that we continue to nurture that sort of innocence and acceptance. they have large or extended families, and do they live with them? Do they have siblings or cousins who are just a little bit older than them? And the reason this is such a big deal for me is because we want children to be as independent as possible. And my experience is, if you've got a 3-year-old but then a 5-year-old in the house as well, the 5-year-old will do everything for the 3-year-old because they can, and they want to show off and they want to look after that child, and that's beautiful and we love that. But we want that 3-year-old to be as independent as possible. So we need to spend some time explaining to families and the other children in that family that that child needs time to develop their independence. And we also need to make sure we're giving that child plenty of opportunities to develop that independence through our provision. Are your family supportive or not supportive? Like I mentioned at the beginning, I hope your parents are generally on board. But in terms of this, what I'm on about is things like, do families understand the value of what you're doing? Do they understand that phase 1 phonics is really important and we're not going to push children to phase 2 until they're ready? Do parents understand that we potentially will be going to a farm visit because the majority of children need to have that experience, even though their child has already had that? If parents are not supportive and they're not willing to extend some of the learning that's happening at home, we have a very difficult job on our hands of supporting that child through their learning in a very small amount of time that they're with us, potentially even just 3 hours per day. And what are parental attitudes like towards things like speaking and listening, reading, writing, phonics, sort of the typical academic things? As a practitioner who's worked usually in a school-based nursery, I can tell you the amount of parents who've brought their children to me and said, it's time he was in a school, or it's time she was in a school because I wanted to learn her academic things. Nursery classes are not what they used to be. We do not focus on academic things any more than any other setting would do. We still teach phonics, we still teach maths, but we do it in an age-appropriate way. Parents might have this idea that when their children go to school in particular, they'll be learning to read and write, they'll be learning to do their counting, and it gives them some kind of weird head start. It doesn't. All quality of early years across the spectrum is at a very high level. It's not like school-based nurseries are going to do anything different. But it's important to have those conversations with parents before the children come to make sure that they know what to expect. The third aspect is staff. Having worked in a range of different sizes of staff teams, all the way from about 15 at one school to a single member of staff supporting me in another, I can tell you that staff makes a significant impact in terms of your culture. When you're designing your provision and your activities, if you don't have staff on board, or you have staff with a lot of different ideas about how best to teach children, or lots of different interests or levels of skills, you are going to have a very different time than the people down the road. So first of all, let's think about the training level of staff. We'd hope that the vast majority of staff working with us will be trained in the early years and hopefully to a high standard. Unfortunately, the skills in the early years sector are fluctuating constantly because we have a lot of people leaving the sector. Or we have people leaving and then coming back again and being sort of out-trained because they've been in Key Stage 2 for a long time. We have a lot of apprentices, we have a lot of staff who've just joined us, and those people are really willing, and it's brilliant to have them, but it's also important to remember that training has to be high quality and it has to be continuous. So when I did my training, I did a 4-year degree in the early years, and there was an amazing amount of gaps in my training that I filled through continuous professional development in my first 5 years of teaching, really, and since. I've done tons of reading, and it's because I recognise those gaps. So you might have a team with really high levels of skill, lots and lots of training, that will bring an enrichment to your environment. They'll understand things like schema play, they'll understand how to develop language appropriately. But you also might have some staff who need more support from the more trained or the highly trained members of staff. What their experience is like. So potentially you might have some staff who've never been to a big city, or they may have never been on an aeroplane, or they may have never been on a ferry or a boat. And so through the provision, when you are talking about these experiences and playing with those experiences and role-playing those experiences, if a member of staff has never done those things, they can't do that very effectively. Now, I'm not saying that you go and give homework to your members of staff. Go to a Chinese restaurant at the weekend so you will understand what you're doing on Monday. No, we don't do that. But what we do is we roll with the experiences of our staff team. The staff might never have been to a Chinese restaurant before, but they may have been to a restaurant in Pakistan, in which case they can bring their experiences that the children around them might also have had into the provision. In terms of their interests, well, let me tell you, a few years ago I was working in a school where I had an EYP who was very interested in baking. At the time I was very interested in gardening. So what I would do on the first sort of 10 minutes of every day, I'd go straight outside and we would do some gardening. And my children got very, very into my interests. They could tell the difference between an onion and a weed, which I have to tell you is incredibly difficult. Well done them. So the children really got into gardening, and considering where we were working, considering the fact that most children in that area would not have had access to an outside space, never mind a garden, that's pretty amazing. My EYP, she was really into baking, and so in our home corner what we would do is make sure we had lots of materials available in order to do baking every single day. And we never said no to the children. If they wanted to access baking, we would get the flour out, they would get a recipe book out, and we would do it. We were able to do that simply because we had a smaller group of children. But it was also set up in such a way that our interests were as important as the children's interests, and us giving them our knowledge of gardening and baking was a really beautiful learning opportunity, and the children became interested in what we were doing. You might have some staff who are very interested in being outside, some staff who are very interested in certain sports. Let them give those opportunities to the children, but don't force them if they don't feel comfortable doing that. Think about the language of your staff around you. There's plenty of staff members who will use quite negative language to explain their own skills and their own knowledge, and we need to be mindful of that because it really does make an impact in terms of the play that we get in our provision. So if you're saying things like, oh, I can't do maths, I'm not very good at maths, oh, I just can't draw, oh, I'm terrible at painting, those types of negative comments will be absorbed by the children, and they will accept that it's okay to say those things. Now, we want reflective people, and those practitioners may be reflective. I am a terrible singer, but I sing anyway. I love it. When you come on my training for Phase 1 Phonics, the first few seconds people look at me like, is he joking? Is that how bad he really sings? Yes, that is how bad I sing. I am tone deaf, but I love it anyway. We need reflective children as well. So we need to be mindful of that language, especially when it's gendered language in particular. So potentially if you are a woman who is saying I can't do maths, or you are a man who says I don't really talk about my feelings very much, or anything along those lines, we want to try and break away from those gender stereotypes. It's important, where possible, to put a little bit more equity in. So if you're a woman, talk about how excited you are about science and maths and sports. If you're a man, talk about how excited you are about talking about your feelings, about going to cook or to look after the babies. Try to break down some of those stereotypes with your language. And if you're a large or small team, so the larger the team, the more hands you have, but also the more opinions you have. And it can be very, very difficult to be part of a large team with lots and lots of people with lots of different ideas, all trying to get into the mix, especially if you've got one large room with lots of adults. A nursery that I've supported in the Northeast has an awful lot of people working in the same space, and even though they have barriers to create different zones for different age children, they are all in the same room. So all it takes is one member of staff who likes to sing, and it does disrupt everyone else. Now, that's not a bad thing necessarily, but you have to be mindful when you're designing your provision that's accessible by a large team. Does it link up with their theories, their understanding of how children learn? If you're designing provision that is only good for you to work in and the children, the rest of the staff will feel alienated and they will not be able to use that provision appropriately. Take everyone on the journey with you. And equally, if you have a small team, you are drawing on a smaller pool of expertise, in which case you may need to find ways of making connections with external team members. And what are staff's views on things like colour, the types of resources that they use? Their views towards pedagogy make a significant impact on the type of design that you'll have for your provision. Many people are going towards natural, neutral, Hessian, glass objects, natural objects, and I love those myself. You know me, I am really into my natural loose parts, but I have worked with some people who are very, very steadfast in their approach to plastic. They want plastic, it's useful, it's clean. They like colour. And so trying to balance that and get the right mix is important. We mustn't steamroll over people who have those types of approaches. We need to find a way to put all those views into one big pot and stir it and see what happens. Each setting will be unique in their approach towards from completely plastic free to plastic fantastic, from colour to natural. They'll be somewhere on a spectrum, and that is the best way to be. Leadership. So if you're a leader, cover your ears. I have had some really epic run-ins with leadership over the years, and I will be the first to say that I fully understand that leadership is very complex, and you are never going to be friends with the people underneath you, not properly, simply because unless those people think exactly like you, you're going to run up against them. And even though I have worked under some really good friends of mine, I have still found it very difficult at times. Something to consider about leadership compared to the rest of the areas in this video is that leadership tends to change infrequently, and leaders tend to be put in place for a particular reason. So you might have a leader who's hired for just general because you're missing a nursery leader, but you also might find that the nursery's failing or a school is failing and someone is brought in to make significant changes, in which case it's unlikely that they will run alongside your culture. They will be there to disrupt your culture because your culture is seen as failing. Now, I think a good leader would recognise that they need to work with a culture to begin with, but sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes people do come in and steamroll over all that colour to put in some neutral. Sometimes they do steamroll across all the staff and don't listen to their voices. Hey, I can't comment on that. I hated leadership. So, thinking about your particular leaders, what are their priorities? It's likely their priorities are linked to parents and Ofsted. So parents will have particular expectations, especially if it's a nursery, about what their children will be able to achieve whilst they're at this nursery. And there are certain sort of contractual promises. When you send a child to a nursery and you've seen that they're really into X, Y, and Z, you expect the child to be exposed to X, Y, and Z and come out the other end happier, healthier, and a little bit more learned. In terms of Ofsted, if they've had a particularly poor Ofsted where writing, reading, maths, speaking, relationships, something was pointed out as being a particular area of weakness, it is likely that in a future Ofsted inspection that area will be pinpointed and it will be necessary to demonstrate a significant amount of growth in that area. Even if they've not achieved something, even if reading results might not have exceeded in year 6 or improved so much in year 6, as long as you've got evidence that you're making some progress, that is significantly better than no improvement whatsoever. And so your leader, whether it's a head teacher in a primary school or a nursery leader or just a room leader, might have certain priorities that they want you to do. And so we've got to be pragmatic in working with our leaders rather than against them. They might ask you to put numbers everywhere. They might ask you to put writing in all the different areas. And it's something that I've really struggled with in the past because it's terrible practice. But hey, it satisfies Ofsted, it satisfies them, and sometimes we've just got to roll with it. What is the background of your leader? Do you work in a primary school with a leader who used to be a year 6 teacher? Or even worse, like a year 9 teacher, and have come to be a primary school head? Do they understand early years? Do they care? I hope so. I've worked with some amazing head teachers, but unfortunately I've also worked with some head teachers who don't really understand the early years, nor do they really care to. They've put people in place who would perhaps be middle leaders in between, but when it comes to things like Ofsted and general skill improvement, it's their way or no way at all, so the middle leaders don't get a look in. That's something to consider, especially if you're working in a school-based setting. You might find that as you move through your journey in teaching, you hit a wall where you're just not able to make significant improvements because they don't understand the early years. And a smaller point, but what external factors are they aware of that will impact your activities and your provision that you do? So potentially you might have some serious safeguarding concerns in your setting, especially around, say, parents. Maybe there's a particular parent who can't access a child, and so they may ask you to be quite sensitive around discussions around family. That will impact our provision because we obviously need to avoid those things when we're doing circle times or when we're in the role play area, for example. And the last two areas I'm going to combine just because they do have an element of overlap. So the last two areas are environment and community. And when I'm talking about those, I'm talking about your internal environment to your home, your room, your nursery building or your school. The external environment, just a little bit outside, maybe your outside play area or the streets around it. I'm also talking about the community, the people that make up the area in which you work and live. So thinking about your immediate environment, your building where you're working, is it a listed building? Is it a new build? Is it a small setting? Is it fit for purpose? I have worked in so many places that have got display boards up there and the children are down here. I've worked in some new builds where the same thing has happened. It's almost as if they don't have any architects who've actually got any children or have ever worked in a school. We've got to work with what we've got, and so maybe you'll just paint your display boards. That might just be the easiest way around it. If you're a small setting or a pack-away setting, obviously that will impact the type of activities you're able to do with your children, because you can't develop your continuous provision and your enhancements very easily because you've got to pack away every single day. So you might find that every day something looks a little bit different. But isn't it amazing how well your staff and your children do catch up with all that? Do you have too much furniture? Does that limit what you're able to do in the provision? Maybe you want a big dancing area or a big movement area inside, but you've got tons of tables and chairs that you just can't get rid of. If you can get rid of them, do try, because they're not really appropriate for most early year settings. But if you can't, we've just got to make do as best we can. Do you have a lack of resources? Very few schools or settings have any money at the moment, and so if you're struggling with your resources, that will make an impact. If you want to change a provision area or do an activity to respond to something, because I can't do anything about Chinese New Year because I've got no resources whatsoever. I think as a sector we do need to move a little bit towards a more low budget approach. We need to accept the fact that things can't always look amazing because we don't have the budget to back that up. And then thinking about your immediate community and environment around you, what are your local shops and amenities like? Do you have Asian supermarkets, Eastern European supermarkets? Do you have a range of different shops like bakers and fishmongers and things like that? I've worked in schools recently where we didn't have any of those things. We didn't even have a post box or a post office. So for bakers, we had to go to Tesco Express and we had to watch the people putting the things into the oven, which isn't really the same thing at all because it's not baked from scratch. We wanted to see the dough on the go. But if you've got those things, how are you using those experiences that the children will have because they live in the area? How are you using those experiences and bringing them into your provision? Are you talking about, we're going to do some pizza making today, but we're going to make the dough from scratch, just like the bakers down the road? Have you been to the bakers? If not, we'll go now. How are you using those experiences in your provision to enrich what you've got? Or are you acting as an island where all the experiences that happen outside are not coming into your environment? You're not allowing those to impact your play and your provision. Do you have shops that reflect your culture, and are you using them appropriately? If you've got a lot of children from an Asian background or an Eastern European background and you have those shops in your area, are you getting your snack from those shops? Are you bringing food that's labelled up with those different brands from Eastern Europe or Asia into your role play area? Are you reflecting the community that you're serving in your role play area, or are you simply filling those with things that you've got from Tesco.com or from Morrison's at the weekend? And are you a rural or are you an urban setting? And does that make a difference to you? Do you think it does? If you're a rural setting, maybe the children have never seen a skyscraper or they've never been to somewhere that's really built up, in which case having a picture of the Taj Mahal and the London Shard in your construction area is a bit weird. Sorry, my foot's gone to sleep. So potentially what you might need to do instead is perhaps have pictures of barns and maybe local shops and local houses that the children can use to be a sort of a provocation, a starting point for their buildings. Maybe you're an urban setting and the children have never experienced things like a farm or seen a river or a stream. Maybe they're not familiar with the idea of it, and so they've seen it in a book and they want to replicate it, they want to talk about it, but they haven't experienced that, so they have no idea what it's about. Maybe you're doing that phase 1 phonic activity where you have the stream in the middle and they've got to jump over the different sounds. Have they seen a stream before? So guys, that in a nutshell is creating your culture. The point of this very long video is to give you an idea of the enormous amount of things that go into making your setting unique. So if your setting is in the middle of a city, you will not be able to copy the same activities that a childminder is doing in the middle of the country. Because you have a different group of children, you have a different amount of children, you've got staff, you live in a different place, and they've got different experiences. We need to move away from what I call the Pinterest culture, which is observing an activity or a provision area and thinking, I'm inspired, I'm going to make it happen in my setting. We can be inspired by those things, but we shouldn't be copying those things, because everything that we do in our provision area, whether it's setting the activities up or the actual resources we put out, those should be linked to the culture of our setting. And every aspect of the culture is important, from leadership to parents, children, your community. All of those things are vitally important. Use this video to get you started with the rest of my training. I talk about creating your culture continuously, because unless you understand your culture and you understand that you create it by being an active participant in it, you are not going to be able to make significant changes to move towards a purposeful provision.